Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation about scaling fake data for the enterprise with the founders of Mockaroo and Tonic. My name is Chiara Colombi. I am the product marketing manager at Tonic, and I'm very glad to be joined by our speakers today. We have Mark Brocato, founder and CTO of Mockaroo, and Adam Kamor, co-founder and head of engineering at Tonic.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
This is the third time we've sat down for kind of an informal chat like this with Mark of Mockaroo, and I always enjoy these conversations and the stories that turn up between these leaders in the field of fake data. For context, both of our products fall within the category of data synthesis, most often in the context of test data generation, but we approach the challenge from two very different angles, and I think it's helpful to set that stage before we get started with the questions. Mockaroo is a platform that enables you to create fake data from scratch based on rules that you define to dictate how that data looks. So you might set like the ratios and distributions within certain data types. Tonic, on the other hand, is a platform that enables you to create fake data based on your data. So you connect Tonic to your production databases and use Tonic's generators to mimic your real world data. And what you're creating is fake data that looks, acts, and behaves like production data, but stripped clean of sensitive information like PII and PHI. So since we approach the same problem from such different angles, I can ask the same questions of our speakers and get very different, but always very valid answers. On that note, we've got a lot of great questions already lined up, but I love to hear your questions. So please drop them in the Q&A, drop them in the chat at any time, and I'll keep my eyes out for them and ask them as they come up. Awesome, let's get started. We're talking about scaling up data generation to meet the needs specifically of the enterprise. And I think it'd be helpful to establish some baselines here around the specific needs and challenges involved. So my first question for each of you is, what, in your view, are the top needs of the enterprise when it comes to data generation?
A completely unrealistic number of fields. Like, it's incredible, some of these data models that people have to live with. I mean, I get it. Like, I remember working, actually when I created Mockaroo, I was working at a biotech company, it was a biotech startup. And one of the products we were, aiming to use or integrate with was like Oracle's healthcare life sciences data model, which was literally so big that they had to create kind of like a Google Maps style browser for traversing the thing, like zooming in and zooming out and panning over, just in terms of number of tables. But one of the things that always shocks me, and it's a different kind of scaling than maybe you think of. You might think of scaling as like, all right, well, I need to generate a terabit of data or a petabyte of data, or you think of it like longitudinally, number of rows. But the complexity of the schemas that you see in the real world and in the enterprise, just the number of columns to translate it to Mockaroo speak, is sometimes really where the challenge can be. And so I'm always careful. Sometimes people will ask me about, hey, how long is it going to take to generate 10 million rows of something? And it depends, rows and columns. It's a product. And sometimes I'm surprised.
The size on disk is, size on disk is how we typically look at it. Really, because I mean, when it comes down to it, that's really kind of the product of the rows and columns, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Mark, I think Tonic's record in terms of just like that horizontal width and the total number of tables and columns, I think our record was a customer. It was approximately like 47,000 tables. Probably average 10 columns per table. So hitting close to 500,000 individual columns. And it's forget the generating for a second, right? I mean, that needs to load in your UI. I mean, rendering 500,000 of anything in the UI can actually be just complex to begin with, right? So step one was making sure the UI would even load, which it did, but it took some work.
Memorize your React components, folks.
Yeah, that's sort of virtualize everything when you can.
Yeah.
I'm going to add on to what Mark said, because there is like the enterprises come to you with a tremendous amount of complexity, and it could be like complexity between columns or just like massive scale in terms of tables and columns and their numbers. I think two other things they care about, and I would just put these at the same level as what Mark said, would be like the utility of the output data. Right. I mean, you're generating this for a reason. So why are you generating it? Well, presumably it's to test something, or to use it in a sales demo, or for machine learning purposes, something like this. These are all, use cases that Tonic and Mockaroo's customers all have. So there's the utility of that output data. And then there's the privacy of that data, right? Depending on how you generate your output data, it might be too similar to the real data, in which case, okay, maybe you shouldn't be using it, right? You can't use the real data. So can you really use a fake version of it that is too similar to it? Right. So it's really just the privacy utility conversation, right? Like they have to find a balance of the balance that they want to strike. As they increase the privacy of their data set, the utility of the data goes down, right? So they might not want to do that. So both tools try to give you that control knob for like optimizing the balance between the utility and the privacy. And I think that's especially important for enterprises because it's super non-trivial to do that at the scale that they are at.
Yeah, I think you've both touched on like the three key points. There's utility, there's privacy, but there's also just the complexity involved of the data that you're trying to create. So what would you say are the top challenges in meeting those needs?
One is design, because a design that works really well at small scale may not be the same design that you would use really well at large scale. And a design that accommodates for large scale may be overly complicated for small scale. So Mockaroo really was designed more with the small scale in mind. And I've added on things that help it scale out over time, just design-wise, never mind performance-wise. Like in the beginning, all I ever envisioned was somebody generating like a CSV file worth of stuff. And then people were like, well, I have multiple tables. So how do we solve the integrity constraints between them? And so it's been a long journey to where we are now. Originally, I allowed people to upload their own CSV files and then reference them in Mockaroo. And then it became obvious, well, people were like generating a series of CSV files, all corresponding to tables that related. So you would go through this workflow of generate the data in Mockaroo, download it, re-upload it back in, and then reference it in future schemas. And it was actually only until about the last year where it would do that whole process for you, where you could just like click create data set, and then you could reference that later, and you didn't have to download and re-upload, and then you could do it at scale. So there used to be a pretty small constraint on how big a stored data set could be in Mockaroo, and it wasn't working for some of the biggest customers. So I wound up doing some pretty radical refactoring to make that possible. One thing I did, and sorry to ramble, but I think this is an interesting cautionary tale for people using cloud services. So
these are the tales I love.
So I used, in order to be able to pick random rows or sequential rows from a really large data set without like downloading it and parsing it, I used S3. And S3 has this wonderful capability called S3 Select, where you can literally like write SQL against an S3 file. And you can just basically say, oh, pick me some random rows. And it does it really quickly. And it's really expensive. Like it's not obvious that they charge you for the compute behind all that until you see the bill. So I ran.
I think, Mark, are you describing is it AWS Athena is what you're talking about?
They may share the underlying same technology, but there's literally this feature called S3 Select.
Okay, interesting.
Where you can literally just like, it's one of the many thousands of objects in their SDK. You can call that thing up and then you can send it a select statement, and it's pretty complete as to what it can do. And I got a bill one month that was like 10x what it normally is, like total surprise. Sure. And then I wound up re-implementing that. I took it from Ruby to Crystal, basically. I used to do it locally with Ruby. Then I switched to doing it in the cloud with S3 Select, and it was like ridiculously expensive. And then now it's optimized in Crystal, which gives you about 1,000 times the performance of Ruby. So it's actually been pretty good. So that's the long journey of accommodating that complexity, and then the scaling challenges involved in accommodating that complexity.
Yeah.
So yeah, on the Tonic side, I'll remind folks of the question. It's how do you what's the biggest challenge you face when you are solving these enterprise challenges? Is that
and how are you addressing it? I would say as a follow-up.
Right. I like Mark's answer a lot on design. And it's definitely true. And that's a good point, Mark. I guess I knew it, but I had never said it out loud before. It's like the design you choose for your smaller early customers is potentially very different than what you choose for your later customers who bring those 47,000 tables that you're talking about. So I like Mark's answer. I'll try to add another one that is maybe a little more Tonic specific. And this is something that we get asked a lot with our enterprise customers. It's okay. You've generated for us a data set. It has good utility. We're happy with it because we've tested it. But how private is it really? So answering that question about, okay, well, how private is the data you've generated? And how accurate is it really? Because when you have those tens of thousands of tables, like you can't go through by hand and manually check everything. So being able to actually answer that question on privacy and utility and kind of give a customer an idea of like, this is how safe you are. These are the risks you're taking is a very challenging problem. And it's one that we've only, I'm saying recent, but it's been in the past 6 months or 9 months, but we've only recently started to kind of tackle it head on via a new Tonic feature called, God, I hope this is the name of the feature. It's called Privacy Reports, I believe. And that's where we answer those types of questions for you. And that's been a real challenge, and it continues to be one. Just because like the mathematics behind privacy and the guarantees that you get are A, challenging, and B, it's actually like a field of research that is like constantly improving and getting better with like the latest and greatest like algorithms and heuristics that are coming out. And Tonic, tries to stay up to date with all of that.
Right, which I think also speaks to another challenge within just test data generation. Any solution that you build, there's so much maintenance that is involved to keep up to date and to improve along the way. We have a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to jump in with quickly. Number one, are there any language-specific libraries that can be used to generate data right inside the code using Tonic or Mockaroo?
Oh, interesting. Mark, I'll let you answer first.
Well, yeah, Mockaroo has always supported Ruby syntax in a few different places. So there's the formula data type that you can use Ruby code to compute values based on other columns. And then there's inline formulas, which is that little sigma symbol to the right of every field where you can use a same formula syntax to just like adjust the output of that column slightly. So that's built in. I have been doing some research lately in allowing JavaScript, which I think has a bit of a wider appeal than Ruby, although Ruby is pretty simple, by sandboxing JavaScript with WASM to get really nerdy. WASM is this kind of new, stands for WebAssembly, and it's basically a new way to run bytecode in the browser. So one day people will be writing their browser-based applications instead of just in JavaScript. They could be writing them in Rust or C++ or any other compiled language. And it performs well, but it also sandboxes really well. So you can run untrusted code without it conflicting with others. But right now it's just Ruby within Mockaroo.
Interesting. So on the Tonic side, our approach to this is a bit different, even though we have explored the idea of letting customers write their own code directly in the product. Typically, when it comes to the point where they need like a super specific custom generator, Tonic's engineers and support team will write it for the customer. Typical turnaround on things like that is typically just a day or two, depending on the complexity of the transformation they need. But a lot of Tonic's generators are actually like composable and they kind of plug and play with each other nicely. So you can actually build quite complex logic just with some of Tonic's more like base transformations, like conditional generators, for example. This is a transformation that allows you to conditionally apply transformations on a given column based on condition statements that you kind of build up based on values either in that column or on different columns. And that's typically how we approach complexity.
There's another question around just capabilities, and that I'll ask before we go back to the subject of scaling. We are in healthcare, the question asker says, and need CCDA documents and XML output. Is XML output supported?
In Mockaroo, yes.
In Tonic, yes, as well.
Okay, awesome, thanks. All right, so going back to the topic of scaling up, let's broaden the conversation and think about scaling up software products in general. The first topic I'd like to cover there is that of in-house tools versus third-party solutions. As you've been scaling up your products, what trade-offs have you encountered between building the tools you need in-house versus relying on third-party solutions along the way?
Oh, we go third-party whenever we can. It is our team is very good at building data privacy tools, and we'd like to keep everyone focused on that. So we go with third-party solutions whenever possible. That could be, for example, like logging and telemetry solutions that we bake into the product. It could be like even like simpler things like our VPN provider and where we maintain our source code and things like this. We go hosted wherever we can.
Okay.
Yeah, same. I've had kind of I don't know, a belief system in the teams that I built that you should only like own one thing, and that should be the one thing that makes your business different.
Yeah.
So
and makes it money, to be frank.
Yeah. Differentiated and valuable. And so, Mockaroo is just one of my projects. I have a bigger day job. But even with Mockaroo, it's always been on cloud providers. I use Ruby on Rails. The whole point of Ruby on Rails is it does like literally everything for you with the minimal amount of effort and maybe the minimal amount of performance too, but it's meant to get things up and running and going quickly. And so, I really just wanted to focus on the design of the application and the data generation. And I'm using all the standard patterns and services. Like I use, I've been using Rollbar since like day one for error tracking. There may be other services out there now, but I've always been happy with Rollbar. And I've switched cloud providers a few times, actually. I try to go as low cost as possible. So I don't actually run on Amazon for the most part. I run on DigitalOcean and more recently Hetzner. So if anybody's looking for a really good cheap cloud provider out there, Hetzner based out of Germany is actually quite good. But yeah, like in other businesses where we've handled, like web traffic, hosting platforms, we say we only want to own the critical path. So the path of the request take through the system, and everything else we want to rent from somebody. Because there's just so many solutions out there right now that there's so much downward price pressure on every piece of software that it's very difficult to recreate something for cheaper, especially when you take the human cost into comparison.
And Mark, you have to be, given the one-man nature of how it's operated, you have to be even more careful, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. Because you have to live with everything that you build. You have to maintain everything that you build. So you feel it kind of viscerally. And I am a man of limited talents. So I'm not a Unix guy. I'm not a sysadmin. I barely am functional when it comes to like keeping a server up and running. Maybe some of my users can attest to that from time to time. So I really am just a software developer, and I try to use as high level managed services as I can.
That's true. Even at Tonic, where we have more engineers, we take it's the same ethos. It really is. It comes down to what you said. It comes down to like you want to focus your people, where you're making your money, which in this case is a data privacy or a data generation tool.
Following up on that, why do you think it is that we so often encounter, especially in the enterprise as well, teams that are saying, no, we're going to build our test data generation in-house? What?
Oh, I can. I'll take a stab at that first. And maybe this is controversial, but I think they underestimate typically the challenge in doing it yourself, and that leads them down a path that often, and there are exceptions, but it often leads to pain and ruin. And I can get into why it's so complicated, but that's kind of a longer conversation. I'll try to say it briefly though. I'll try to kind of paint a picture and explain this. When you want to create like a de-identified or fake version of your production database for testing, it's one thing to fill that output database with data in columns that is the correct data type, for example, right? Like anyone could do that. But then you got to go connect your application to this now de-identified database. And that application has certain assumptions it makes of the data, like of the relationships between rows and the relationships between columns. Like if the value in this column is 1 or 2, then the value in this other column must be null, things like this. And then if the application doesn't get data that it's expecting, it's going to crash or fail, and you're not going to be able to do your tests, right? So what you end up doing is when you create these like programs to generate, fake data for yourself, in-house, you end up having to recreate all of the business application logic in your test data generation application. Otherwise, your test data isn't worth anything because you can't actually run your application against it. So it gets very complex very quickly, and it's not obvious at the beginning that it's going to be so bad because most people don't appreciate how hard something is when they first start it because they don't have a lot of knowledge of it to begin with, right? And that, like, to the previous conversation of you want to go third party when you can because it's their expertise, right? Like Tonic and Mockaroo are both very good at solving different shapes of this problem, and we've been doing it for a long time. We do it across many different customers, and we know how to generate that really good test data.
I think I totally agree, and I see another angle too, which is more psychological. Like, people, it's more fun to build than to buy in general.
Yes,
like engineers, we're put on the earth to build things,
especially a greenfield app. Something from scratch. Nothing's more fun than that.
And it's especially tempting to like build tools because they're conceptually easy to kind of understand. Like it's a problem that you can create all of your own requirements and just set about starting to build stuff. And it's probably an easier problem to wrap your head around than actually what you're getting paid to build. Like oftentimes the reason why, for Tonic to sit there, for somebody to build a CICD pipeline, it's a lot easier to understand than somebody who had to figure out how to de-identify that data, come up with that core algorithm. It's like, I'd rather go and work on a thing where like, I get to exercise my muscles as an engineer and build stuff and get the reward mechanism of seeing something run, but I'd rather not like solve this really incredibly difficult problem. So let me go and work on some tooling. I see that a lot from very good engineers. And so it's like we have some counterproductive instincts as engineers, actually, that we'd rather go work on things that are easy as long as they kind of give us that reward mechanism of shipping something.
Yeah, I remember you bringing that
like
up
that.
in a previous conversation as well. And I thought it's kind of like engineers can sometimes be their own worst enemy if they're saying, no, I can build it, I'll do this, and then you're totally distracting yourself from your core work. So
that's right. I mean, I'll take it a step further. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I bet every engineer in this call has started a project thinking it's going to be easy. And then after day 2 or 3, you start seeing like, oh my God, this is very complex, and you stop and you don't do it anymore. Like that's very common when writing these test data generation applications.
Yeah, I have a saying that underestimating level of effort, all progress depends on it. We would never do anything if we were good at estimating.
That's good. That's a good counterpoint, actually. Yeah, that's true.
That is great. I'm going to take that back to the team because I think that'll make people feel like a little better. So I do have another question from the audience I'll pose quickly. Please address NoSQL solutions like MongoDB JSON queries. If you could talk about those.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, let's see. Mockaroo does have some built-in data types specifically for Mongo, like the ID type that you generate there. And it does, JSON output is one of the most popular types of output. And as of recently, you can now link JSON data sets that you generate in Mockaroo to further schemas that you generate in Mockaroo. So the relational integrity is there as well. So I think it's JSON and CSV are maybe 50-50 in terms of usage on Mockaroo.
So on the Tonic side, on the Tonic side, we have full support for Mongo. So that means you can connect Tonic directly to your production Mongo database or to a copy of it. Apply transformations on various paths in your JSON documents, and then Tonic will generate a new Mongo database that has all of the same data as the production, but the specified paths will be de-identified according to whatever transformations you've selected.
Great, thanks. So I want to narrow down, we've been talking about third-party solutions. Let's narrow down that category to what I think is, given some events earlier in the year, a rather timely and possibly even controversial category, that of open source tools. So I'd like to hear if either of you were impacted by the Log4j vulnerability. We could also talk about, if we wanted to, what happened with Faker. But first, just generally, what are your thoughts about relying on open source software within your platforms?
To me, the answer is very similar to do we go third-party tools when we can? Okay. Yeah, we go open source whenever humanly possible. Most of the database drivers that we use for connecting to the various databases we support are open source. Our stack itself is primarily .NET, which is now open source through Microsoft. We were not affected by Log4j in any serious way, just because we don't really run any Java. For a short period of time, we were using a log shipping solution that I believe used Log4j in it, but we haven't had that in any version of the product for well over 18 months, I think. So we weren't really impacted in any serious way, I'd say.
Yeah, I remember previous jobs were Java-based, and Log4j is such a staple there. I imagine
Oh yeah, it's everywhere.
So wide-ranging, and will be rippling through time for a while, I think. Fortunately, Mockaroo is Ruby on Rails, so it wasn't susceptible to that particular problem. On another project I was working on, we were hit by, not Faker, but the guy. So the author of the Faker port to JavaScript, I think, and then another library having to do with colors in the terminal. He was either called Colors or something else. He kind of like went rogue, and he pushed up a version of both of those libraries, which are widely used, that had an infinite loop in it that printed like an American flag or something. And it's like he was angry that Fortune 500 companies were using his code and not paying him for it. And it caused a certain amount of panic. And there's been like a few of these things over the last year where, remember, like going back a few years ago, there was Left Pad, the guy who made this one-line library, pulled it down off of NPM.
Yeah, broke everything.
Broke.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it does seem like the community is becoming a little bit more unhinged in the last few years. And we're all incredibly lucky to have this amazing driving force of open source software to build on. And I hope it keeps going that way. But I understand people's worries about open source. Like when you really think of it, we're all like dancing on the Titanic right now. That like every day we push up code that CICD runs, and it runs an npm install, and it pulls down like 1,000 libraries, and hope nobody did anything wrong with those libraries, and hope you're locking your files correctly, and somehow people didn't figure out how to get around that.
Mark, what do you think of the new, well, it's been at least a year now, the GitHub feature where you can actually, I think you can donate to open source projects directly through GitHub now, can't you?
Yeah, I have not been a part of an effort that's done that yet. But I will say that like we've used this product called Sneak. Do you guys use Sneak at all?
Is it SNYK?
Yeah.
No, we don't use it right now.
So we used Dependabot for a while, which is pretty easy to use in GitHub, and it's very kind of overzealous at pointing out every possible thing you could upgrade, and then you upgrade them all and you break everything. Sneak is like much more judicious. So if you're worried about open source software vulnerabilities, I find Sneak is a good balance between just like crying wolf all the time and actually providing you with meaningful feedback. And they have a module in there that'll actually inspect your code for vulnerabilities, and it finds like some pretty shocking things.
Oh yeah, we actually use Dependabot for dependencies. Interesting what you've said about Sneak though. Maybe we'll give it a go. And we use Sonar Cloud for scanning our own code base, and it does various types of static analysis, including security vulnerabilities, which it typically points out good things. I'd say there have been times where we're like, no, that's actually not an issue, and you can just dismiss it, then it goes away forever. But it certainly points out issues as well. It helps.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like just going back quickly to the Log4j, the only way we were impacted was a bunch of customers being like, what do we need to do to resolve this? And they're like, oh, nothing, because it's
nothing. It was great. I know. Yeah. It was real nice.
Yeah, I had to say, like, people reaching out to me the next day, does Mockaroo use Log4j? And they must have had to reach out to every one of their 1,000.
Oh yeah. Oh, 100%. Yeah. And a lot of, I mean, there are tools on the market that will scan ship binaries for what libraries and whatnot they're using. Like, Tonic is typically a tool that is run on the customer's prem. And we just ship Docker containers, and many of our customers actually scan our Docker containers at every release, looking for known vulnerabilities that will, and we're also scanning them before we release. So typically nothing is found, but things have been found in the past, and now would be a good time where they would be able to confirm whether or not we're using Log4j, save everyone an email chain, I suppose.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I can imagine in our space, the scale of a user's data, we've already talked about this a little bit, is going to put a certain strain on performance, which would require a significant amount of optimization. Can you offer any insight around optimizing platform performance for the enterprise and large scale deployments?
Yeah, I can. Performance is something near and dear to my heart. It's one of the things that I very much like to be involved in at Tonic, and still actually actively write code in that area, even though not as much as I used to. I'll give two good rules for performance optimization. One, don't do it at all until everything works. And two, only do it after you've actually profiled running code. Trying to optimize things without actually looking at performance traces and performance profiles, I think is like, and I want to really not mince words here. I think it's really a fool's errand. Like, you can't optimize unless you know where the actual hotspots are. And there might be slow pieces of code, but if they're not the actual bottleneck, optimizing them doesn't do anything for you. You're really just wasting time and adding complexity. So the way we solve this at Tonic is twofold. We actually ship Tonic with a built-in profiler. So when customers are having performance issues, we can actually run a profile on their site using their infrastructure with their data and get like a very accurate profile of where things are slow. And then we can use that to make actual educated decisions on where to optimize the code. And then recently, we've actually started shipping tooling within the product that is actually constantly running profiles. So we can look at things at like a more holistic level, like, oh, how does this release differ from previous releases in terms of hotspots, et cetera. And that's really helped us up our performance game.
Yeah, it's a great point. I've said that many times to engineers who work for me, that like performance optimization is really kind of a harsh mistress, in that like,
yes,
it often doesn't make sense why something got slower or faster. That's why measuring is like really critical. Like, be numbers based and don't be emotional about it. Because for example, like, I heard recently that Ruby 3 introduced a really good just-in-time compiler optimizer, but actually it has some pretty poor results for Rails, which is like the biggest library for Ruby, obviously. So you should always measure before and after you do anything. And like, don't assume that you actually understand all of the chaotic effects that are lending themselves to performance. You know, for instance, sometimes like, because of just-in-time optimizations, the first time you run something, it'll be much, much slower. But if you're taking advantage of those, it'll get much, much faster. So like, a small change you make might actually make the first one slower, but then subsequent runs much faster. So which do you actually need? And then another piece of advice I would give is, do your best to decouple the code from infrastructure, because you want to make use of scalable, elastic infrastructure as much as possible in this day and age. Like, Amazon and all the cloud providers have forced prices down so low in a day of inflation where everything is going up in price. You know, cloud computing really isn't. And so if you make choices in your software that assume any kind of configuration of number of processors or space on disk, or anything about the hardware layer on up, you can paint yourself into a corner. So I was fortunate enough to luck into a setup in Mockaroo where I could scale out across as many processors as I could pay for on AWS, and customers can do that as well. So customers that have much larger needs than what I can accommodate on Mockaroo.com, they can run their own infrastructure, spin up 20, 48 core servers, generate data across them, and then shut them all down. And it costs $1 or $2. So yeah, decouple from the physical world as much as possible. Decouple software.
Yeah. Mark, the point about separating infrastructure versus the code is nice. We at Tonic, and this is just food for thought because I think it's interesting, we don't have that exact luxury, unfortunately, because the beginning of any Tonic job is reading from the source database, the customer's database, and the end of the job is writing to a database, right? So you end up like the performance bottlenecks within Tonic jobs are often actually the infrastructure themselves, right? Like, Tonic scales out very well with CPUs in terms of actually processing the data, applying the transformations. But, you can optimize that all day long. If the output database is slow to write, then making those performance optimizations doesn't matter, and you actually are infrastructure constrained at that point. Which is why, it comes back to like that profiling conversation, right? Because like 9 times out of 10 when we profile, we find that we're just like disk or network constrained. And then it just becomes a discussion of, okay, well, do you mind upping the instance size, for example, like on an RDS instance or something like that? But yeah, I mean, yeah, it gets complicated, I'd say. Oh,
Okay.
Mark, we can't hear you all of a sudden.
Yeah, especially with RDS, there's so many knobs to turn there in terms of like
Yes.
dedicated IOPS and all that stuff. Like they make a dramatic difference on the performance of your database.
They really do. It is something that we've started doing recently is starting to like introspect a bit more into like the source and output databases that Tonic is operating on, so we can kind of like draw like better conclusions around where we actually are constrained. And yeah, it gets so complicated. And then like that's one thing, and then imagine like, okay, is Tonic installed in the same region as the databases, or the databases in the same region, right? Like how many network hops does it take? It like everything matters when you're talking performance.
So there's a question around, somewhat related to infrastructure, around how both of the tools work with CI/CD environments that need to stand up databases of test data as part of the CI. Could you both speak to that?
Yeah, I'll speak for Tonic. It works very well because Tonic outputs for you not data; it outputs a database filled with data, right? Once you have that database, you can do with it whatever you like. You can take a snapshot of it and restore it programmatically during a CI/CD run. You could even trigger the job itself during a CI/CD run using our REST API, right? Like there's many ways to integrate Tonic with like the various workflows in your organization.
Yeah, I think Tonic might be the better answer here. So Mockaroo has quite extensive APIs. I'll say that. You can create your own mock API endpoints. So like if you're building a UI and the API that you would be consuming isn't ready yet, you can mock it with Mockaroo. And then all the data generation that you do using the website, you could also do via the API as well. And you can like build your schema, save it, and then call it from the API if you want, or you can just create the schema entirely from the API. So it's got a fully functional API, but that's basically what you get. So you'd have to make use of that in your CI/CD to generate data, download it, and load it into your database. It leaves quite a few steps if what you're aiming to do in CI/CD is like fire up a real database and then run your tests against it. Mockaroo leaves some steps to be done there, whereas I think Tonic provides you a much more direct integration.
That's right. And, I noticed there's actually a few more folks on the call now than were on the call at the beginning. And so Kiara, maybe it'll be worth again mentioning the distinction between Tonic and Mockaroo and like the different like use cases for which they're typically used.
Yeah, of course. Would you guys I can do my quick high level overview, and then if you want to speak to the use cases.
Yeah, I think the high level overview from the beginning would be great.
Sure. So basically, what I said at the beginning is we're both in the space of data synthesis, both platforms. But the difference is that Mockaroo is designed to create fake data from scratch. So you are able to set rules. It's rules-based data generation. You define the rules to dictate how that data looks. You can say, I want ratios. If you're generating, you gave a really great example one time, Mark. You showed generating gasoline prices over the months of the year, and you can say, well, it'd be higher during these months versus these months. I thought that was a great example. But so anyway, yeah, you're creating data from scratch. You're just defining what the data, what data types you need, and what that data needs to look like, how it needs to be distributed. Whereas Tonic, on the other hand, is a platform that enables you to create fake data based on existing data. Typically, that's based on your production data, basically. So you connect, like Adam was saying, you connect Tonic to your production databases. You can connect it to more than one database, and you use Tonic's generators as kind of building blocks to mimic your real world data. So the data that you get, the fake data, it really is designed to look, act, and behave like production data. But at the same time, a big step of the Tonic process is de-identifying the data. So removing all the sensitive PII and PHI and replacing it with fake data that gives you the same feel.
That's right. And to the point of the CI/CD question, I mean, the output of a Tonic job is a new database that is schematically identical to the production database. And most of the columns and rows are in fact unchanged. It's just the columns with actual sensitive information are replaced with fake but realistic data. So we have customers, for example, who have switched from using production data to Tonic data in their development environments, and their developers don't even know. Like they have made the switch, waited a few weeks, no developer said anything. Like that's how like realistic the data can get. So just to kind of put a pin on that. Thank you, Chiara, for doing that.
Was there anything you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, it's funny. It kind of draws a parallel to our build versus buy argument in that. There have been many customers of Mockaroo that also became customers of Tonic and use both tools concurrently. I think that's one of the luxuries of the problem I'm solving with Mockaroo versus the problem that Tonic solves. Mockaroo is necessarily very easy to pick up and play because there's no dependencies. Like you don't have to give it access to production data. You can just start playing around. So that part of the engineer who's like, I just want to start building something. Mockaroo kind of tickles that fancy a little bit, that you can very easily just start generating some data. And then I imagine some of the customers find, well, like, hey, this is proving to us that synthetic data generation is very useful. But if we continue going down this road forever, it's going to take us forever. And so they bring in Tonic, and then it just does the whole database, and they're done. I imagine that's one kind of path to upgrade as well. Yeah.
There's another area, facet of scaling up that we haven't covered yet that I also wanted to talk to, and that's the topic of scaling up your teams and your companies. Because Mark, you've got Mockaroo, but you're also a VP of engineering. You've worked across startups and you've seen them rapidly grow, and Tonic is also on that same path. So I was wondering if either of you have words of advice in that department.
Yeah. So I spent most of my career in startups where there was one engineering team, like ranging from a few people to maybe like 15 people. But I have recently served in a role that was much, much larger, where it's 100 plus engineers. And the biggest difference, I think, as you scale up is you have to spend so much time on communication that you want to make sure that you have really good documentation and regular meetings on things like roadmaps and the reason behind why we're doing what we're doing. What you aim to create, I think, is a lot of alignment so that people can act autonomously in a large organization. Because at a certain point, beyond maybe 10 or 15 people, you need to break up the team. And then you have two teams, and those two teams need to remain in sync. And they either remain in sync by meeting constantly and stepping on one another, or somehow being aligned and acting autonomously in each other's best interests towards the same goals. And so that's the one piece of advice I would give for people that are moving up in the engineering world and are responsible for more and more people, is to focus on communication and alignment, because it allows small organizations to work in parallel efficiently.
Mark, I'm gonna make an analogy to something you said earlier. Earlier you said, the design for your early customers that are smaller and simpler is not necessarily the design for the later customers, right? Like the processes that you put in place for small teams do not scale for larger teams, because it becomes harder to communicate across a larger number of people, and to keep everyone kind of marching towards the same goal, or really to make sure everyone knows what the goal that they're marching towards even is, to the point that Mark made. So to add on to what Mark said, when we started Tonic, there was 4 founders, myself, Andrew, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today, and then 2 others, Ian and Carl. For the first year and a half or so, it was really just a small team, 4, 5, 6 people. Chiara, you were there for it. And we didn't really hire engineers until a good deal later, just a little bit before COVID started in March of 2020. And I very much had this idea of if you build it, they will come. Meaning, we're a cool startup, we're doing cool stuff, we're going to be flooded with world-class engineers that are all going to be knocking down the door to work here. And boy, was I wrong. So, in terms of scaling up the team, I think Mark had some great points, but in terms of actually getting the people so you actually have a bigger team, I didn't appreciate how hard it was to recruit. And I didn't realize that most of my job, not most, but a lot of my job as a founder early on, but even still today, is actually centered around recruiting. and trying to attract top talent. So to that point, if anyone on this call is an engineer and you're looking for a very exciting engineering role, you should definitely reach out to us after the call, because I do this everywhere I go. I let everyone know that we're constantly hiring for engineers and other roles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
plus one on the recruiting thing. And there's an interesting struggle that I've faced too, which is now it's easy to hire people everywhere. Many businesses are willing to work with people as independent contractors. Everybody just works remotely anyway, so it kind of doesn't matter. The only thing you're fighting against is time zones. And at a certain size, I was able to put together a team where everybody was in a different country. Like we had a 10-hour time zone span between Eastern Europe and West Coast US, and everybody was kind of on equal footing. And at a scale of 10 engineers, people could be flexible enough with their schedules to have enough overlap to make it work. But as you scale up, that does become more painful, as when you're a small startup, you're attracting a different kind of people with different motivations than a larger business. And so people are a little bit less willing to be that flexible with their schedule, and they feel that it's harder for them to have a direct impact in the business. So they're not willing to give up so many different things in their life and live this kind of weird lifestyle of stretching time as you scale up.
Yeah, that's right.
Stretching time. Yeah, I hear that. Well, those are all the questions that I have specific to scaling. And I'd love to, if anybody has any more questions, do feel free to ask them in the chat, in the Q&A. I'm still looking out for those. Thanks for the questions that have come through. My kind of final question, given that there may be folks in the audience who are enterprise companies and are looking specifically for this solution of test data generation, what is one thought, what is the key takeaway that you would like them to leave with today?
Well, Mark, would you like to go first, or would you like me to?
Go ahead.
Sure. I'm going to give multiple thoughts, which I know is not what I'm being asked to do, but I'm going to do it anyways. The first thought is, think back to the onset of this webinar where we talked about kind of the pitfalls of trying to do this yourself. Really be mindful of that. If you try to build your own applications for generating test data, it can be very painful for the reasons that we previously stated. So there are tons of great providers out there, Mockaroo, Tonic, others. If what you need is a de-identified version of your production database that is really identical to production, but the sensitive columns have been replaced with fake and realistic data, then you should definitely give Tonic a try. And the website, www.tonic.ai. Or just reach out to us at hello@tonic.ai and say you heard about us on the webinar. And we can also get in touch with you that way.
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate some things I said earlier, and maybe I'll add a new phrase that I heard somewhat recently that I really like, which is called run into the spike. If you see something dangerous that you'd rather not deal with, go against your instincts and run towards it instead of veering away from it. And that is don't be skeptical of bike shedding on tooling. Spend your time on what is differentiated and valuable for your business, and rent or buy everything else if you can. Because in the end, your customers are paying for, if you're lucky to have customers, paying for the one thing that makes you different from all the other thousands of businesses out there. And it's so hard, I'm sure the Tonic founders know this, to come up with an idea for a business that hasn't been done before. And most of us are lucky enough to work at a business that has some idea. It's found someplace in the world. And you should really, your spidey sense should tingle when you're not spending all of your time on that thing. If you're spending your time on building tools or other things that aren't part of your core business, it's not a great use of time generally. But at the same time, I do believe in sharpening the saw. So you should have good tools, but you should take a little bit of time to find if they're just out there to buy rather than having to build from the start. Because most things are available, most ideas have already been thought of, and they're actually quite cheap.
Awesome. Thanks to both of you. We do have a couple more questions that came in through the chat. The first one I'd like to ask is, I'd love to hear about anyone using these products with Salesforce or other SaaS platforms.
So Well, I know, Mark, you'll also be able to talk about Salesforce, I think. So as a rule with Tonic, as long as you can point Tonic at a database that we support, then Tonic can operate on it. So any tool that actually gives you access to the underlying database used to store the data for the application, Tonic can operate on.
Yeah, Salesforce, the company, was the first enterprise user of Mockaroo, and it's been widely used at Salesforce for a long time. And I know that certain partner organizations of Salesforce are also wide users of Mockaroo. But I don't, despite that, I actually don't have anything specifically built into Mockaroo to target the Salesforce community. It's always been a good fit for the kinds of things that you build with Salesforce. I mean, there's a lot of data types around customers and relationship management and organizations and personal data and things like that. But there's nothing hidden in there that's very specific to Salesforce.
All right, the other question was, and I can kind of speak to this, asking around why a company would need fake data to begin with if they already have big data. And it was also answered pretty well in the chat, but just to reiterate, oftentimes it is just a matter of access. You can't grant everyone access to sensitive production data. If you've got customer information in there, personal PII, either there's GDPR, there's CCPA here in California that all regulate how that data can be used, and it eliminates the option of using it for testing and development of software. So that it comes down to data privacy and not only doing what's right by the law, but doing what's right by just being a good, respectful company of people's information.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it's way more common than not that engineers are not allowed to touch the production database without a very high level of clearance, and certainly not allowed to copy the data out of there anywhere for any reason.
Yeah,
that was less true. Maybe it's becoming more and more untrue, that statement, I would say. Like you're seeing fewer and fewer companies that are actually using production data for non-production purposes now.
Yeah, especially with GDPR, even things that we would have thought 20 years ago are like harmless are no longer considered harmless anymore at all.
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, and GDPR, even calls out specifically what you can and cannot use your users' data for. And it has to be just the purposes of why it was collected in the first place, which is to say the application, and really nothing else.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you both. This has been a pleasure as always. So much fun to hear you guys talk about this. And thanks to everyone for joining and for all the great questions along the way. If you'd like to learn more about Mockaroo, head on over to mockaroo.com. Such a great resource with a very well-deserved fan base. There's also a great community forum as well. And if you'd like to learn more about Tonic, visit Tonic.ai, where you can book a demo directly with a member of our team on our website. You can also request a 2-week sandbox, which is basically our free trial to take Tonic for a spin. You can connect to your own data if it's in MySQL or Postgres. Either way, we'd love to hear from you. So do reach out. You can also contact us at hello@tonic.ai. All right. Thanks to everyone for joining us. And thanks so much to our awesome speakers. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.